Okay, so then let's get going. Hi, everybody. I'm going to start with an apology. Sorry you don't have me on video tonight. I'm a bit ill at the moment, so I'm not feeling the greatest. So please forgive my croaky voice and the fact that you can't see me. But with that out of the way, just really wanted to give a big warm welcome to everybody to this month's Grassroots Call, particularly for those of you that are joining us for the first time. My name's Aaron Oxley. I'm the Executive Director here, and really hope you enjoy the call. And even though we haven't had the best month, we hope that it will still get you all excited about motivating you to get involved in our mission to fight global poverty. So let's start off with some news that isn't nearly as good as we'd like it to be. As I mentioned last month, progress on fighting poverty isn't inevitable, and it's really only through hard work and persuasion that change happens. And that can be slow to come, and we've got to build it step by step by step. And sometimes that takes a while, and sometimes when you've done a lot of work, particularly with somebody like our former Secretary of State, Priti Patel, when she leaves office and we get a new Secretary of State, you need to begin that work all over again. Having said all that, it's a preamble really to ask you to not be too disheartened by the disappointing news that came just last Friday, when the Secretary of State for International Development, Penny Mordaunt, announced in Senegal that the UK government will commit £225 million to the Global Partnership for Education. Again, for those of you joining us for the first time, £225 million may seem like an awfully large amount of money. And of course, we results are not looking gift or horse in the mouth. We're very welcome for that contribution. It's going to make a big impact. But unfortunately, this figure is really quite well short of the figure of $500 million US, which is around £360 million, which is what we were calling for, and which is what the Global Partnership for Education said is needed from the UK to achieve high quality and equitable learning for the world's most vulnerable children. You can go have a look at the wording of the announcement on DFID's website. That's dfid.gov.uk, always worth looking at that. Penny Mordaunt there uses very forceful language in support of global education, and this is very welcome. And we know that in part and thanks to everybody on this call, the UK remains a global leader in education. But however, despite her strong statements in support of GPE, we're disappointed that she didn't go further in turning that into fully funding the announcement. You might have seen in the UK pledge, they say that it was a 50% increase over previous funding levels, and that's actually technically true, but it's slightly disingenuous because by the time you work out all the maths and the different time periods and the differences between the pledged amounts of money and the actually delivered amounts of money, the pledge they made at this replenishment is actually exactly equal in value to the pledge they made 4 years ago in terms of the number of pounds they pledged to give per year. In effect, even though they will end up giving more, it's not actually a raising of the level of the UK's ambition. On the other hand, we know that the global crisis in education needs much more ambition than ever. These were the words that were used by the Secretary of State. So even though we can be proud that the UK remains the largest donor to the Global Partnership for Education, we're naturally disappointed by this gap between her words and actions and think she's missed a big opportunity to show British leadership on the world stage, which is something this government's continually going on about. I'd just like to pause for a second and really thank everyone who's taken action over the last year for a more ambitious GP replenishment. We saw literally hundreds of thousands of young people take part in the Send My Friend to School campaign. That impressed MPs, impressed our former Secretary of State, bodes very well for the future of social action. From April onwards, many of you made our Education Counts campaign come to life, writing letters, visiting MPs and getting them to sign up to joint letters to the Secretary of State. Several of you had excellent articles in the media, you posted blogs, you tweeted. None of this went unnoticed, and a huge thank you from us. So we don't always get all we ask for every time we take a campaign action, but you can be confident that your efforts have played a big part in bolstering the UK's commitment and getting us the biggest pledge we've ever had. But we're going to hear some more about those actions in just a minute. A little more on education and some follow-up on that. You'll be interested to see that DFID has also released a new policy on education, You can also find that on the DFID website as well. Maybe somebody that's a bit more on it tonight could find that link and post it into the chat for the Zoom call. But I'm pleased to say that this shows this new policy framework really shows a big commitment to reaching the most marginalised, especially girls and children with disabilities, and focus on the quality of learning. These are all areas that you've been championing, and it's really good to see the department taking positive steps in the right direction, even if it wasn't fully backed up with a fully financed pledge. So a massive thank you again for all your work, and we're going to keep on building on that as we go forward, really pushing for higher levels of ambition for education amongst donors globally to meet the challenge of the global goals. So let's look at rather than just the UK's piece, let's look at the big picture. In the email we sent out to Network last week, we said that should the commitments made in Senegal turn out to not to add up to GP's overall pledging target of $3.1 billion US, all donors, including the UK, will need to step up and do more. Well, that is in fact the case. The total pledge by all donors came to $2.3 billion US, so $800 million short. It is the largest sum that was ever invested, and it's $1 billion more than over the previous three-year period, but it's also $1 billion less than needed. And while donors fell short at the conference, it was low-income and conflict-affected countries that really stepped up. They committed $110 billion between them to fund their national education programs, recognizing that education is both a human right and an antidote to poverty. There's still more than 264 million children out of school, and Friday's news will help put a big dent in that number, but we're still going to be leaving far too many behind. So much of the growth in funding and global leadership on education is thanks to relentless advocacy by people like you. So we're going to build on that to keep delivering those resources. Does anybody want to share their feelings about their education work or anything that they did or any responses they'd like to make right now?
Yeah, can you hear me? It's Pete.
Go ahead, Pete.
I was a little bit confused by one element of your presentation just now, where you said that effectively the amount pledged by the UK government is the same as before. It looks bigger, but in reality, it's not. Certainly like some statistics on that if you're able to email that to us when this call is over.
Sure.
But
yeah.
later on you said it was the biggest pledge we've ever had. Twice you said that, so I'm not sure how to square those two statements.
Yeah, sorry, I should have been a bit clearer. The amount of the pledge was 225 million, which comes out to 75 million pounds per year, and that's the same level of pledge that was given previously over 4 years. But if you remember, Pete, both last time and this time, the pledge was capped at 15% of the total contribution. So that means the UK, even though it pledged very high last time, because they put a cap on, they actually ended up giving very little money in comparison to how much they pledged. Whereas this time, they're pledging at the same number of pounds per year with the same cap, but because everybody else has stepped up, it's highly likely that the UK is going to disperse most, if not all, of its pledge this time. So the reality is this is in some ways a slightly more realistic pledge that will be delivered, whereas last time it wasn't because of the conditionality that they placed upon it. We'll try and get some numbers written down and circulated so you can see that all spelled out in numbers. But it was to do with the conditionality last time as to why the same level of pledging didn't deliver as much resources.
Okay, I didn't make much of that, so I definitely need to see it in written down. Thank you very much.
We'll do that, Pete. Thanks.
Thank you.
No
I've
problem.
got a question, please.
Sure, go ahead, Jill, just as long as it's a quick one.
Okay. One of the conditions that Penny Mordaunt said was that they wanted GPE to do certain things before they'd give the money. What was the disagreement with GPE?
So this is a continuation of the conditionality that they placed on the GPE last time. The last pitch they gave, there were certain things that the performance targets and so on that the GPE needed to hit before the funding would be fully released by DFID. I don't have the figure front of mind right now as to how much it was, but it was not a small amount of money. This time, 30% of the total amount pledged will be held back pending the meeting conditionality. I haven't seen that conditionality, and I haven't heard a report back from GPE as to whether that's onerous conditionality or not. Our opinion on conditionality generally in results is that you shouldn't do it because it sets a terrible, terrible precedent, and that's not how multilaterals work. The conditionality may be quite benign. It may actually be quite good in terms of moving the GPE forward on things that it needs to perform better on. Not having seen it, it's hard to comment. But as a principle, there are other ways to accomplish that besides placing conditionality on your pledge. The UK plays a strong role on the board. They're very vocal, and they're a good partner of the GPE. And there are other ways to influence and direct how it works other than placing conditionality on your pledge. Because, you know, like I said, sometimes if the conditionality is quote unquote good conditions, it can move the conversation forward. But equally, if they're bad conditions, they can handicap the organisation. And if 10 different donors put 10 different and conflicting sets of conditionality on the organisation, it becomes paralysed and can't move. So we're really not happy about that at all. So I think there's not much more I can really say on that just now because I don't have the details. And I think we probably need to move on with the call, or else my introduction is going to take up all the time we have. I think let me see where we're at. So okay. So let's see. So one of the things that we say quite a lot is that the missing piece of the jigsaw on international development is the political will to get the job done. And without the public pressure, there's going to be far less government focus on international development issues. And so as I opened the call, we've really got to see that as something that we're working at long term. So if you're new to campaigning, maybe you've been doing a lot of education work with us, and it's the first thing you've been involved in, please don't go away thinking you made no difference. You did, and we just need to keep on applying the pressure until eventually we get the UK to where we want it to be. And don't forget our very important collective project to achieve the global goals, sometimes called the Sustainable Development Goals. And that really is the gold standard. We've got all the world leaders held to a commitment to end extreme poverty by 2030. That's only 12 years away. And in the previous period, the 15 years of the Millennium Development Goals, poverty roughly halved. So it's possible, though as I said, by not any means inevitable that we can do this. It's the hardest to reach and most vulnerable people who risk being left out of this. So it's going to take a continued involvement right up to the end and probably beyond 2030 as well. It won't happen without you. And another thing that needs to happen if we're going to get the wider support for this project is to see much broader public support for development. Something that many of you know on this call all too well is actually in reverse, fueled by negative, politically motivated and untrue reports of aid being wasted. One very positive statement by the Secretary of State last week, picked up in The Guardian, highlighted the very effective use of UK aid to combat the outbreak of Ebola in West Africa, the recent plague outbreak in Madagascar, and last year's famine in Somalia. It's absolutely right that she should be speaking up for the amazing life-saving achievements of her departments when, as it almost always is, aid is spent well. And it's these kind of announcements that help the public understand what their money is being used for and allows them to feel rightly proud of paying their part. Be assured that DFID is very, very aware of the need for the public to understand and support their work, and they're working alongside the NGOs in the sector to communicate what UK aid achieves, and we will see more of this throughout the year. But most people who need persuading don't read The Guardian, and we're all going to need to challenge ourselves to think about how we can communicate differently to reach people who aren't naturally supportive of helping others beyond our shores. I think we're going to hear in a minute a little bit more about one such initiative, which is happening in the West Midlands. So as usual, before we go over the topic of tonight's call and introduce our speaker, I'm going to hand over to Hannah, who I believe is with the Oxford group this evening, for a roundup of what you've been up to this month.
So thanks, Aaron, and hi to everybody from Oxford. A big thank you to the Oxford group for hosting me this evening. It's really great to meet them for the first time. I hope everyone can hear me. As I just want to say thank you to start with to everyone who wrote to Penny Mordaunt in advance of the GPE financing conference. She received at least 18 letters and emails from results campaigners, and this is just the actions that we know about. So a little reminder to everyone to please let the results office know if you take action, as it's really helpful for our monitoring purposes and to measure our impact. To do this, please just email either me or Naveed and let us know so that we can record the action. Following last month's call on education, Chris from the Brighton Group wrote a great blog on inclusive education. If you haven't already seen it, then do take a look at the Results Brighton blog page. They're hoping to put a new post up every month following the call. Chris's blog was also shared really widely by Results Australia and cross-posted by Results US. So really big well done to Chris and the Brighton Group. Jill from the Stort Valley Group also wrote a fantastic article on education for the Independent Catholic News, which has been shared on their website. Unfortunately, as you know, we didn't get our full ask at the GPE Replenishment Conference, but during an evidence session with the International Development Committee last week, Penny Mordaunt spoke about the evident public support for GPE in global education. All of your actions are exactly the sort of thing she was talking about, so thank you again for all of your efforts. Excitingly, Results was just one of 4 larger organisations to be approached by DFID to take part in a 6-week regional communications pilot in the West Midlands. Vicky from the Birmingham Group met with DFID to discuss. The regional pilot will test different messages around UK aid through contrasting communications channels at a local level. I'm on the phone at the moment, so I can't actually see who's on the call, but Vicky, if you're there, are you able to share quickly some of the things that you spoke about with DFID?
Hello, yes, I'm here.
Hi.
It was a really interesting conversation because they're particularly interested in engaging with the marginally engaged, they called them. So people that broadly think we should be nice to people living in poverty, but who aren't very informed about it, don't really think about it very much, and often worry about corruption or waste or those sorts of things. And that was the sort of population that they're particularly interested in targeting. And that was really interesting, but also quite challenging, because I think it's an audience that we're not necessarily always well set up to get to automatically. So we had to do quite a lot of thinking about that. They're going to be running various different activities. We've been asked about some op-eds already, potentially going on radio and that sort of thing. So I'll keep you posted as to how that develops. They're particularly trying to get to people that are older than students, which was a challenge for me at the university. So again, I think as a network, us thinking about how we can get out into groups that don't routinely engage with this stuff will be really important. We're going to try and do some work at the university with students who are living at home, and so perhaps therefore, well, are still engaged with their local communities and could perhaps get to people who wouldn't normally read anything or go to an event about international development, but might be interested because they're son or daughter's interested. So that's the sort of thing we're doing.
Cool, thank you very much, Vicky. That sounds really interesting. I'm really looking forward to hearing how it all goes. So before I pass back to Tom and Aaron, I've also just got a couple of events to mention. So first, our training day in Birmingham is happening this coming weekend. We still have a couple of places left, so please do let us know if you'd like to come. The booking information you need was sent to you in this month's newsflash, but if you can't find it, just contact the office and we can give you all the information. It should be suitable for both new and existing campaigners, and we'll also be joined by Results staff Callum and Laura, who will help us to get to grips with the topics of transition and UK aid, which we'll also hear a little bit more on tonight. There will be a brief update on what we'll be doing in 2018 on TB, because as some of you know, 2018 is going to be a really critical year for gaining the political commitment needed to tackle the disease. I'd also just like to quickly mention the national conference, which this year will take place on the 2nd to the 4th of June at the NCVO building in London. If you're on our email list later this week, you'll receive more information and booking instructions, and hopefully we'll see lots of you there. Thank you very much, and I'll now pass that to Aaron.
I think it's actually going to be me now, Hannah. Hello everyone, how are you all? It's Tom down in the London office. So now for the topic of tonight's call. which is a new and rather complicated threat to all the good work that has been achieved in global health over the years by UK aid, an issue which we're referring to as transition or donor withdrawal. If you've had a chance to read this month's action materials, you hopefully have got the basics. This is a really hard technical issue, and in the office, we've also struggled to get clear on the main issues and solutions which international aid community needs to grapple with over the next couple of years. Without this technical stuff being done right, real people are going to be affected, and we can see more rather than few people slipping into poverty. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker to introduce us to this topic and set out the challenges for international aid donors. She is Amy Dodd, who is the director of the UK Aid Network. Amy has worked extensively in politics, policy and campaigning, including most recently as an advisor in the Shadow International Development Team in the UK Parliament, focusing on gender, economic development, conflict and fragility, and climate change issues. She studied economics and political science at the University of Sydney as well. Amy, are you on the call? Let me just unmute you.
Yeah, I'm here. Thanks for having me on.
Great. Amy, a very warm welcome to you and many thanks for joining us tonight. Let me just introduce who we have on the call. So we are joined tonight by campaigners from all around the UK, some of whom are very experienced at gaining support for international development issues, as well as others who may be newer, but share our passion for taking action to overcome global poverty. I think you already have met some of them when you kindly came to speak at our national conference in 2016, and we are very grateful that you can share some of your time and expertise with us once again. We also have our Senior Policy Advocacy Officer on Child Health, Laura Kerr, who many of you will know. Who'll be able to add more on results perspective on transition if our questions end up going in that direction. Amy, our groups have 3 pre-arranged questions for you, and then we'll open up to the floor. For those of you on computers, feel free to ask your question on the chat function. And for those of you on phones, you can text in to my number, which is 07867 562 861. That is 07867 562 861. Just before we take the first question, Amy, can we ask you to take a couple of minutes to tell us a bit about yourself? What is your role at UCAN in relation to international aid? And what is it that fires you up to work on these issues every day?
Great. Well, I just want to start by saying thank you very much for having me on. It's amazing to get a chance to kind of talk to people who are doing some of the advocacy and campaigning work and stuff like that. So looking forward to the chat over the next half hour or so. I guess in terms of what I do, so UCAN, the UK Network, we're a network of NGOs around the UK, been around for about 10, 15 years. We work a lot on sort of joint working where it makes sense for the sector, so for all the kind of organisations to pull together and work together on things like aid effectiveness. So doing some research on how we think we, support better transparency or, kind of better impact and results on the ground. So obviously we work with organizations like Results quite a bit as well. In terms of what gets me fired up, I guess I risk of sounding a little bit cliched. I've always had let's change the world and make it a little bit better. And I think, being able to see actually that, some of the stuff you were talking about earlier in the call, that actually you can make a difference and, we can make things better. And having spent some time out working with colleagues in developing countries or going out and looking at some of the program work, really seeing the very real difference that makes in real people's lives is definitely what gets me going.
Great, thanks for that. We're now going to get into a discussion about what transition from donor support actually means in reality and some of the complexities of the coordination between donors that is going to be needed. Can we go to Oxford, please, for our first question? And please introduce yourself before asking your question. Do we have Oxford?
Hi, my name is Tiffany. I'm a group leader from Oxford. We'd just like to ask, why does the issue of transition matter?
Great. Well, nice to start off with a nice, easy question. I guess I would say probably 2 sort of groups of things from my perspective. I think one of them is that, sort of stepping back and looking at the bigger picture, the aid landscape is changing a lot and the development landscape is changing a lot with it. And I think that's very much true in the UK, but it's also true globally. So Aaron talked about the SDGs, the global goals, and they've kind of changed the framework and the landscape that we're all operating within and kind of thrown some really difficult questions in there about, you know, how do we reach the people who are furthest behind, who are hardest to reach, for example. But I think also you're seeing donors behave in maybe not entirely new ways, but, you know, things are changing a lot. So if I look at what's happening in the UK, there's a much tighter and clear alignment of our development spending, so our aid spending and all the stuff we do around that beyond just spending money, to our own national interest and to national security interests. And that creates some pretty challenging tensions in the system, I think. We're also seeing different changes, like a lot more aid is being spent outside of the Department for International Development, so by other ministries who don't have maybe the same development expertise as DFID does. You know, everyone was talking about spending on education, and one of the things we've seen looking back at the statistics, for example, is that spending on what I would consider kind of core social services, so things like health and education, whilst it's remained relatively steady in terms of the numbers, it's actually declining as a proportion of what we do. So we might be spending the same absolute number, but relatively it's less of our aid budget as our aid budget has gone up. And I think that's an interesting shift, and one we need to be watching out for, because as Aaron was talking about, we know how important these things are to development, the sustainability of development. I think as well, seeing within that, you know, what are we spending money on within that? So we do still spend a lot of money on education, but there's been a big push towards privatizing that. So private education, which is a very different way of doing education in a place where people don't necessarily have a huge amount of disposable income. So I think there's some real challenges there in terms of how the landscape is kind of developing. Lots of other stuff that I think is interesting. You know, we focus a lot more on economic development now, and maybe a little bit less on those social sectors, as I was saying. The UK is much more involved in crisis response. So, you know, the Ebola response stuff, we're probably one of the biggest donors to humanitarian causes and humanitarian responses like that. But I think alongside that, obviously the big thing for me about why transition matters is fundamentally about protecting all of the gains that we have made. So, you know, donors like the UK and developing countries and all the other kind of multilaterals and actors, development actors, NGOs included, we've spent a lot of time, you know, building up better education systems or trying to deliver kind of better health outcomes for people. But actually those things are very much at risk. So as countries transition, so as they move from receiving aid to maybe not receiving aid, those developments can sometimes be a little bit, they can be easily lost, I think, is the problem. So sort of thinking about how we do transition better and how donors do a better job of making sure that countries transition out in a way that's sustainable and where we protect those gains that we made is really important. But actually part of the problem is that you can see, instead of, you know, we don't tend to get a really kind of gradual, natural, kind of easy transition. And actually the minute donor countries think that a country is about to transition out of aid eligibility, they tend to start pulling back. So actually even before countries crossed that line, they're losing funding, which tends to have an impact on things like how much they can spend on their health services and things like that. So I think, you know, looking at the kind of landscape we're in and figuring out how we do it all a little bit better and make sure that we hold on to the things that we fought very hard to win.
Great, thanks for that. Right, over to Norwich for the next question.
Hello there, Amy. My name's Mark from the Norwich Group, and our question is, why should donors provide support to middle-income countries when there are more poorer countries needing support?
Yeah, I mean, that's, again, it's a really tricky question. It's probably one that you'll see come up quite a lot in the media. You know, why are we giving aid to India when they have a space program or whatever? And those are reasonable questions to ask when if you compare, you know, Ghana to Sierra Leone, which was just hit by Ebola, there's obviously two very, very different countries there. But I guess I'd say a couple of things. One, so what I was just saying before about trying to kind of avoid that cliffage where we lose all the funding and a lot of the development gains get lost. I think that's an important reason. I think thinking about, you know, where poverty exists, right? So it's about, you know, where are the world's poor people? And there is a lot of poor people living in middle-income countries, or, you know, certainly lower middle-income countries. So I think, you know, we need to be thinking about, if we want to achieve those global goals about ending poverty and kind of delivering a sustainable world, we need to be thinking about where we need to be spending money. But I think maybe most importantly, you know, when we talk about development, we tend to confuse it with just thinking it's aid spending. And of course, that's not true at all. And donors like the UK can and do a lot of different things beyond just funding and what they kind of spend on different things. So it's all about the kind of technical assistance, or, you know, working with a country's tax authority to improve domestic tax collection, or tackling corruption, or doing a lot of those things. So I think, you know, really important in this transition conversation to think about the other kinds of support that can be provided beyond just funding for school places or something like that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Amy. Laura, I wonder whether you might want to pipe in here with some specific examples, maybe from Nigeria.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Tom. I think I can link an example from Nigeria to the kind of the first question about why transition matters. And that's because even though a country might have moved up in terms of its income bracket and is supposed to be wealthier, doesn't automatically translate into the fact that they have more money to spend or will spend more money on basic services, especially around health. And the fact that a lot of middle income countries still do, in the case of Nigeria, for example, have a higher under 5 mortality rate and lower immunisation coverage than the average of low income countries. And that's because each country, even though they may be wealthier, might not be in a position in which they can expand their health budget, for example, to the extent that we want. And the main thing around kind of transition for us is that it's about the sustainability of services going forward, but the fact that there are still massive gaps when it comes to access to basic health services like vaccination or being able to access nutrition services you need. Even when you become middle income, you reach middle income status, doesn't mean that there are lots of that people are able to access those services. So from Nigeria, for example, has an immunisation rate of 33%. So that's appalling. That's less than half of children who are born are being immunised. And for me, you know, there's lots that we would like to see the Nigerian government do to tackle this, but they're not in a position due to fluctuations in their natural resources that they've come into that can mean that they can spend the vast amount that they need to improve their health system, which is already really badly underfunded, not functioning, doesn't have enough human resources. But that's a middle income country that's losing funding at this time, which results we're working hard to make sure that the transition that it's going through happens in a way that the situation for the people who can't access health services are not made worse. I hope that gives a little bit of a kind of case study example.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Laura. Right, now for our final pre-prepared question, which is with me here in London.
Hi there. So my question is, what are we asking? Sorry. What are we asking the UK to do differently?
Thank you. I imagine Laura and others might come in with some more specifics, because I know you guys have been working on a campaign for a while. But I think, so when I said before that I work on aid effectiveness a lot of it's about trying to get donors to change the way they do aid and development. So, you know, they started kind of 15 years ago and trying to kind of break that idea of donors coming in and imposing a way of working or imposing their priorities and their decisions on developing countries. And I think one of the things, you know, that we've seen that's quite difficult at the moment is, you know, that trend is kind of going backwards, that we're going back a little bit more to a kind of donors setting their priorities, developing countries having to sort of fall in with that to some extent. It's probably a bit of a simplification, but, you know, it's quite a big challenge. It's important because actually, you know, better country ownership, so developing countries having a much stronger sense of ownership and guiding and delivering their own development tends to be much more sustainable, and it tends to have much higher impact. It's actually cheaper as well quite often. So I think from my perspective, it is about getting donors to change the mentality a little bit away from we get to do what we want to what is it we can support you to do. And again, I think that's something that's really clearly written into the global goals, into the sustainable development goals. In the context of kind of transition, I think, there's some really obvious stuff, and I think, Laura can probably talk about it in some slightly greater detail than me, but it's, we don't have a good plan for how we do that. So actually donors just don't think, the UK, but also others, don't tend to think about, okay, well, from the very word go, much less a couple of years before we know we're going to be ending aid, they don't tend to have a plan in place about how they're going to manage that and how they're going to work with the country to manage that, which does mean sometimes that things that the donors have been funding or have been providing support for suddenly fall over. And that's big important things like health systems. That's a pretty fundamental problem. And particularly if donors have just been kind of acting a little bit more on their own without working with local government or local civil society or whatever, those things can fall over relatively easily. So I think, the UK in particular, thinking about that from a much earlier stage and doing a much better job of coming up with a kind of a thought through, developed, consult with the government that you're working with, consult with local civil society and all the other kind of, local government and important actors, and make sure that you kind of deliver something sensible, would be probably the biggest thing we could change in the short term.
Great, that's an excellent answer, Amy. Laura, I wonder if you want to mention what we are specifically calling for the UK to do as part of this month's action.
Yes, perfect. So building on what Amy said there's certainly, you've highlighted a lot of the challenges which donors like the UK are facing, but really it's happening kind of all around us. So in the UK, and from a results point of view, we're working on 3 main angles around this. The first 2 are directly about what kind of DFID does and its own policies and principles. As Amy correctly highlighted, there's a lot of, there's not enough planning and preparation being done, in our opinion. And transition is something that is kind of fairly new. It's happened in a few countries before, but we're seeing kind of more and more at this point that these are real difficult challenges that countries and donors are dealing with. So we would like to see a public framework published by DFID or some kind of guidance note, which explains fully exactly what principles they're using around transition, why they're making their decisions, and what does that process look like. At the moment, a lot of this thinking they say they have, but it's all internal. So we're asking them to be more transparent and accountable about the decisions that they are making, and how that kind of guides their work. And some of you eagle-eyed policy wonks like myself out there today might have seen that DFID have just today launched a new kind of policy, a new guidance document themselves on how they're going to be working on transparency all around the world. So we would like them to see themselves held to the same account. And within that, transition is such an important issue, especially across the next 15 years. As Amy's also already correctly pointed out many times, if we're going to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. And we think there needs to be someone within DFID at a very senior level, director level, who can really guide the work that DFID does on transition as a global leader on international development around the world, making sure that that policy is implemented from what DFID does bilaterally. Kind of moving on to the third angle of what we do, also what they do in guiding the big global funds like Gavi, the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, TB and Malaria. DFID have a lot of influence over these organisations because they are such wonderfully large donors to them. But these organisations themselves have their own policies, and we want to make sure that they are fair and that they are developed in a way that makes sure when donor financing changes, people are not left behind, and that we are still striving to make sure that more people have access to the health services that they need, because at the moment there's just too many people missing out. So the 3 things for us are the a transition policy framework guidance document that DFID publish, so that we can see and know what it is, and share that best practice with other donors as well, to have a director level responsible, and to make sure that they're using their influence and using their best practice principles across both their bilateral and the work that they're doing with multilateral organisations.
Great, thanks Laura. Thank you everyone for those questions, which I hope have given us a sense of exactly why effective transition policies are needed. We're now going to open up to the floor to anyone who has questions, and we'll take as many as we have time for. So we've got around 10, 15 minutes. A reminder of the number to text questions to is 07867 562 861. That's 07867 562 861.
I have a question from Macclesfield. It's Ricky, if that's okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Ricky.
Thank you, Amy and Laura, for all that information. I'm just wondering, the three things we're asking for, first of all, they sound totally brilliant, and we're asking them of DFID. So is this something that DFID, I mean, are they aware that we're asking for these things? Are these kinds of things that DFID are already aware that they need? You know, to what extent are we pushing an open door, and to what extent are we, you know, kind of being full frontal opposition here?
Yeah. Will I go ahead with that one, Amy, or do you want to add any context?
No, go ahead. I think, yeah.
So this is something that we've been working on at Results behind the scenes for actually quite a long time now. Because it's so complex, we've spent a long time gathering the evidence, trying to make sure we know exactly what path do we want to go down and how are we making those decisions. But in the last couple of months, I would say that there are a large number of people within DFID who have got copies of reports that we have launched and have had letters kind of explaining our position on this. Some of you might remember just before Christmas, we launched a 4-pager which looked at this, which we can make sure the link's in the chat for anyone who's interested. So we sent some letters to the old Secretary of State, kind of engaging her. But at the start of this year, with the new Secretary of State, there's a new permanent secretary, which you'll have seen in the background notes. We've sent them all letters, and DFID's even had a new chief economist, so one of the main people who are crunching their numbers and deciding some of their strategy. So they've all got letters, and we have kind of numerous meetings with different teams within DFID. But just to put that in a bit of context, the recommendation is built on a report that the Independent Commission on Aid Impact, ICAI, which some of you might have heard of, produced, kind of reviewed DFID's position on transition and how it was going about this just over a year and a half ago now. And one of the recommendations in that, and some of the evidence that came out of that, was DFID aren't being transparent and don't really have they're not really coordinated on the inside as they should be. So they're aware of that. That was something then that the International Development Committee then questioned senior DFID civil servants on. And we're really trying to build on that. So they're aware. Whether they agree with us at the moment is still something that we're not. We wouldn't be asking you to write letters if they were completely on side with us already. But we think there's scope there. And just one last point. The Secretary of State set out recently in a press release and an article that was in the Telegraph her top 5 priorities in her new role. One of which she talked about kind of transition and this changing aid relationship without mentioning that word. She talked about countries kind of standing on their own 2 feet, which is not surprising based on her position on things. But about the fact that they will put money in when countries themselves are also putting money in. And recently just visited Kenya and looked at a project which the Kenyan government are going to take on fully by 2024. So we know that this is something they're really thinking about. What does sustainability look like? How can we be making the most of the aid we have just now, but how are we really making sure that this is a transformative process for kind of long-term sustainability of projects? So we think there's a real opportunity here. The new permanent secretary, a new Secretary of State, forming all their ideas at the moment. And I think some of your letters will be some of the first and most interesting that I'm sure they'll pass the permanent secretary's desk. I'm sure he probably doesn't realise that too many of the general public even know who he is. So I think there's a really good opportunity just now.
That's great, thank you.
Thanks for that, Laura. I see we've got a question here from James in Brighton for Amy on the chat.
Yeah.
So this is such a vast and technical subject area. Do you have any suggestions on how to communicate this to a less technical audience, or elements to focus on which help bring this wide-ranging and complex issue into focus?
Yeah, so I read that a minute ago and I've been thinking about it a little bit. It's a difficult one to talk about, I think, with the public, because it's not straightforward. And as when we were talking before about, why should we give aid to middle income countries when they're poorer countries, it's a kind of political one as well. So I think that's a little bit tricky. I think putting it in context helps. So, some of the stuff Laura was just talking about, and actually, if I was you, I would definitely go and have a look at the kind of 4 pages and stuff they've done. They're excellent. So I think, the kind of context about, getting people to understand a little bit more what this is, and maybe framing it more as that this is part of the route to away from dependence on aid, actually. So instead of countries continuing to rely on aid, it can actually help to move countries forward and, make sure they're not only do they not need aid right now, but they don't fall back down that ladder in, 5 years or a couple of years or something like that, which does happen, unfortunately. So I think that kind of context. I guess to my mind, generally picking real world examples helps people to understand it. And I think certainly some of the stuff that I found interesting is, being in a country like Kenya, actually, which is, yes, still a developing country and still, has quite a long way to go up that ladder, but you can see they're definitely kind of making progress. So, thinking early on about how we kind of build sustainable systems and programs and stuff like that makes a lot of difference. But I guess, I don't know if you've got any examples from your own life. So I find it, connecting it to things that I understand. And I guess, I don't know, maybe trying to draw the comparison to something that we do right here today. Like if I think about, what's a good example? We don't raise our kids to 18 and then kick them out the door and forget about them, right? Like, sorry, that sounds a little bit infantilizing. I probably wouldn't use the child example when talking about countries, but, there's a sense in which we understand that actually, the process of becoming more independent or more financially independent is one that takes time, and it generally takes some support along the way. And I think also the bit I was saying before about really trying to avoid, the big thing for me is let's not have spent, 50 years working with, Kenya and the Kenyan people, and then just step away and have the whole thing fall over again. That seems like a colossal waste and a huge impact on people's lives. So I guess as much as you can do to bring it down to a kind of a real level, and talking about real people, I think makes a bigger difference. But yeah.
Great, some great suggestions there, Amy, thanks. So I see you've got a couple more on the chat. So from the Norwich group, have any middle income countries facing this problem talked to each other about this? And are Gavi and GPEI aware of this problem?
Yeah, I mean, there's a group of middle-income countries who, they actually act quite coherently in places like the UN and stuff like that. So no question, they definitely talk to each other. I think the multilaterals are aware of this problem, but it's a question about how much political will there is to change how they do business. Because there's a cost to doing things differently. It's not sort of, it's not cost-free, I suppose. I mean, I know you guys, results, you work much more closely with Gavi and stuff like that, but I think, all the multilaterals, whether it's Gavi or GP or the World Bank or, various UN bodies or whatever, they're all very aware of this issue of kind of transition. It is something that people talk about, but I think it's also a difficult one. It's not one with a really easy answer, because it actually requires us to do some complicated things like change the way we interact with countries, and that's quite a big challenge to get past. Not to say we can't do it, not to say we shouldn't do it, but it requires political will from donors as well. So getting the multilaterals to change is about getting the boards to drive change, and the boards are the donor community.
Oh. Hi, as I've been unmuted, I'm guessing I'm supposed to jump in and just agree with all of that.
Oh, I was on mute, sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say, do you want to chip in and add something on Gavi and GPEI?
Yeah, sure. I think we're seeing more and more attention to this issue. It's something we talk to them about regularly, both Gavi and all of the partners within GPEI. It's something we know they're discussing at a board level, but the difficulty we have, as I can't really say much more than Amy, is the political will to do something and to change something. It's not that there is an acknowledgement out there that this is an issue, but part of it is because it's new, there's not a lot of evidence about how to do it, and that requires a lot of thinking and actually pushing actions that are different, that haven't been done before, that are tackling a really difficult issue when there are kind of limited resources out there in terms of development. Donors are really focused on value for impact, efficiencies. There are lots of different issues and everyone has their specific one they want to pick up, but there are certain governments we know are really pushing for this. It's an issue, for example, around GPEI, for all it's very technical at the moment, was one of the main issues at the WHO Executive Board, which is the main kind of decision-making body of the WHO. Polio transition was a major issue for them, and we assume it will be again when all 194 member states meet in Geneva at the WHO World Health Assembly in May. So from a polio perspective, we're certainly seeing that up the agenda, and we've heard very promisingly from the UK that that's one of their kind of 4 priorities for that whole WHO decision-making process, which is great. But it really is about turning in this issue, translate it into a sense of urgency and action now, and that's why kind of we're trying to bring it up the political agenda here in the UK as far as we can.
Thanks, Laura. I've had a question come in on the text. Which specific countries are about to transition from lower income to middle income?
Ooh, do you know, I can't remember off the top of my head who's kind of going from low income to middle income. I mean, one of the challenges around transition is this, you know, we talk about things like income levels as if they're a really good descriptor of where a country is. And whilst they give us a bit of a snapshot, they actually don't tell us very much at all, right? India is an upper middle income country, but a huge chunk of the world's poor live in India. Brazil is also a middle income country. Ghana, I think, just graduated to middle income. Just graduated, I might be wrong on that one, but it's just about to, it just has, or something like that. You know, you've got a huge degree of diversity within those groupings. So, you know, it doesn't tell you a lot of things about stuff like inequality. How resilient are they to things like climate shocks? You know, all the stuff we just saw with the hurricanes tearing through the Caribbean shows countries that are largely high income countries, actually. A few of whom have been absolutely decimated by the impact of the hurricanes. So income level is a kind of, it's an approximation of how a country is doing, but it's, if we're honest, it's a pretty poor measure of development, actually.
Great, thank you. I think that's all we have time for tonight, unless someone else has got a burning question they want to ask Amy or Laura. Speak now. No. Okay, so please join me in saying a massive thank you to Amy for joining us this evening. Your experience will, I hope, really help our campaigners do some powerful advocacy over the next year or so. So thank you again for taking the time to join us. And thank you to everyone else who joined our call tonight. Thank you for all that you are doing, and good luck with your actions this month, which is to write directly to the new DFID Permanent Secretary. That's the most senior civil servant in the department. He and his staff will need to understand the complex issue, and at the moment it's clear there's no sense of urgency around this, and certainly no political will, as you might well imagine. Hopefully, writing this letter will help you get your head around how to communicate this issue before we ask you to explain it to your MP later in the year. We need the department to understand the issues before we start inciting parliamentary questions and the like. Lastly, this month we'd like to give you a heads up on our March action on TB, so I'd like to introduce you to our new TB Parliamentary Officer, Yannicka, who'll give you a bit more information. Yannicka.
Hi everyone, I've just turned my video on.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank you.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm clear here.
Hi, brilliant. It's really great to be able to join you today, and I'm really looking forward to meeting you in person, hopefully very soon. As you know, this year is going to be really important in the fight against TB because of the upcoming UN high-level meeting later in the year. The negotiations for that meeting are going to be taking place after Easter. And so we want to use World TB Day this year, which is on the 24th of March, to demonstrate the really strong public and parliamentary support for ending TB, to make sure that the UK government really prioritizes that process. There's more information about how you can make sure that happens in the background sheet 2 of this month's action materials. But basically what we'd like you to do is to try and meet with your MPs in the first half of March to tell them about why ending TB matters to you, and to encourage them to sign a letter that the all-party parliamentary group on global TB will be sending to the government on World TB Day. And if any groups are feeling particularly passionate about the issue, we'd also really like to encourage you to consider hosting an event on World TB Day, because it falls on a Saturday this year. You could even consider inviting your MPs and getting them to attend and to really build that relationship with them. We don't want to overload you with things to do, but know that arranging meetings with MPs and organizing events can take a little bit more time. So wanted to give you a heads up now. We'll share more information during the call in March. As I said, there's more information on the background sheet, and otherwise we're always here to answer questions or to offer support. So if you get in touch with Hannah or Naveed, they can connect you with me personally, and then we can make sure that you're supported in your actions on TB in March.
Amazing, thank you, Yannicka. I hope that's all clear, but as always, please do get in touch with the office if you have any questions, and do let us know what you're up to or what you are planning. Good luck and enjoy the rest of your evenings.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
But do we ever actually?
Hi, Jill.
Hi, Pete. All right,
Bye,
I've
Jill
got
and
it.
Pete.
Hi there, I've got it sorted now. I've got my video working and all the rest of it.
Where are you sitting?